Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down the legendary military machine and the totally revolutionary battlefield tactics of Alexander the Great. We're talking about a story of pure audacity, brilliant engineering, and just sheer tactical dominance that literally changed ancient warfare forever. So was Alexander the Great actually a military genius, or did he just happen to inherit the greatest army on Earth? Well, let's dive right into this, because to really understand his unprecedented success across the ancient world, we have to look past the myth. We need to analyze the actual tactical plays he ran on the battlefield. It's super easy to just slap the word genius on him, but the reality of how his army actually operated on the ground, that is way more fascinating.
Here's the playbook for today. We're going to look at the ultimate war machine, the famous hammer and anvil concept, and then dive into his specific first strikes at Granicus. From there, we'll cover how he defeated the numbers at Issus, tamed the behemoths at Hydaspes, and finally, look at the tactician's lasting legacy.
Let's start with part 1, the ultimate war machine and the inherited arsenal. Okay, 4.3. This staggering number represents the length and meters of the sarissa pike. Alexander's father, Philip II, took everyday herdsmen and forged them into a professional army armed with these massive wooden spears. And let me tell you, this gave Alexander's soldiers a huge range advantage over standard weapons. Think about the physics for a second. Macedonian soldiers could literally strike you long before your shorter spear or sword could even get close to them.
And those massive pikes were the backbone of the legendary Macedonian phalanx. We're talking about a highly mobile, incredibly tight formation of professional foot soldiers armed with those 4.3-meter sarissas and interlocking shields. This formation was capable of overpowering enemy groups that were way, way larger. It basically created a solid, immovable wall of power that could absorb devastating charges and just keep pushing forward with relentless momentum. It was essentially a bristling, impenetrable forest of wood and iron.
The ancient historian Plutarch really hit the nail on the head when he said the phalanx is like an animal of invincible strength, as long as it is as one body and can keep its shields locked together in a single formation. That quote just brilliantly captures how unified these soldiers had to be. They had to act as a single body, basically like a living, breathing ancient tank. These guys were training for years just to master the tiny, complex, small unit movements required to wield those giant pikes together without, tripping over each other or breaking their lines.
Moving on to part 2, we have the hammer and anvil, the master concept.
So before we jump into the specific battles, we really need to grasp the core tactical philosophy driving this whole army. It all comes down to this: the anvil and the hammer. The anvil was the foot companions, with their heavy pikes acting as this immovable wall holding the enemy line. The hammer was the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen swooping in as a highly mobile strike force attacking the flanks and gaps. The crucial takeaway here is that the infantry pins the enemy down, like an anvil, while the elite cavalry swoops in like a hammer to just smash the flanks. The infantry wasn't actually there to rack up all the kills. No, they were there to hold the enemy tightly in place so Alexander's elite cavalry could swoop in and deliver the knockout blow. All right, let's look at part 3, Granicus, the first strike, and how Alexander solved the river crossing problem. In 334 BC, at the Battle of Granicus, Alexander finds himself facing a heavily fortified Persian force right across a river. Now, trying to cross a river against an enemy that is literally just waiting for you, that is traditionally a recipe for total disaster. But check out his aggressive cavalry deployment here. Alexander completely throws conventional caution out the window. He leads his cavalry directly into the absolute thickest part of the Persian line, right up there on the high ground. He doesn't hang back at all. He spots exactly where the enemy leaders are clustered and drives his forces straight up the muddy, slippery riverbank right at them. It turned into this incredibly brutal close-quarters fight, basically a cavalry battle using infantry tactics. And Alexander? He led from the very front, wearing a highly visible white-plumed helmet. He practically baited the enemy, turning himself into a giant target. But this totally sped up the chaos and turned a really precarious river crossing into an absolute rout once the Persian center collapsed. He took on massive personal risk, but he completely trusted that his men would follow him anywhere. Next up, part 4, Issus, defeating the numbers with the hollow rectangle. So, at the Battle of Issus, Alexander is outnumbered more than 2-1 by the Persian king Darius III. This is a massive spatial problem. How do you not just get entirely surrounded? Notice how Alexander solves this by forming a hollow rectangle.
By staggering his lines and positioning himself on the right wing, he ensures that even if his smaller forces get completely outflanked by Darius, they aren't defeated. By echeloning his lines and keeping reserves ready to go, he made sure his army could fight effectively in multiple directions at once. He literally turned a huge numerical disadvantage into a flexible defensive fortress.
But there was a catch. Darius had the chariots. Yes, chariots with literal blades attached to the wheels. Sounds terrifying, right? Let's walk through Alexander's brilliant play step by step to neutralize them. First, they advanced at an oblique angle. Second, they baited the chariots to charge. Third, and this is wild, they literally just parted their own lines to let the terrifying chariots drive right through harmlessly. The highly disciplined Greek soldiers just reached up and pulled the drivers down by the reins as they sped past. And then, step 4, Alexander drove his cavalry like a wedge straight into the newly created gap in the center, heading right for Darius himself. It caused the Persian king to completely panic and flee the battlefield.
This brings us to part 5, Hydaspes, taming the behemoths, and the combined arms attack. Fast forward to India in 326 BC. The Macedonians are facing their most terrifying obstacle yet, war elephants. This was a completely new type of warfare for the Greeks. But look at how Alexander builds on his misdirection strategies in this combined arms attack. He deliberately baits the Indian cavalry to shift their position, which perfectly allows his commander, Coenus, to sweep entirely behind enemy lines, totally out of sight. He purposefully drew all the enemy's attention to one side, so his hidden reserves could just snap the trap shut from the rear.
But what about the elephants? Well, he knew for sure he couldn't charge horses directly at them, because the horses would be absolutely terrified. So he rolled out these anti-elephant tactics. First, mounted archers shot the mahout drivers. Then, he used his infantry phalanx to surround the beasts, using those massive sarissas and javelins to cage them in. The confined elephants started to panic, and they ended up turning around and trampling their own Indian troops. Finally, they finished off the tired animals with axes and swords. He took the enemy's greatest weapon and quite literally turned it against them.
Finally, part 6, the tactician's legacy, focusing on speed and supply.
Now, executing all these incredibly complex tactics across the known world at an unprecedented speed required nothing short of a logistical revolution. Just look at this timeline. 334 BC at the Granicus River in Asia Minor, 333 BC at Issus, 331 BC at Gaugamela, all the way to 326 BC at the Hydaspes River in India. He marched a 50,000-man army across deserts, mountains, and rivers at a blistering pace. And a huge reason he could do this? He abolished those slow-moving ox carts and forced his soldiers to carry their own backpacks. While other ancient armies were bogged down by massive baggage trains, Alexander's army was essentially an ancient rapid deployment force. And this brilliantly illustrates how he solved his logistical needs. For sea supply, he used the Greek fleet and marched alongside rivers. For foraging speed, like we just said, he ditched the large baggage trains and set up advanced bases. For transport, he replaced ox carts with horses, and later even used camels in the Middle East. This logistical mastery was the true secret engine behind his tactical genius. It allowed him to constantly stay on the offensive. He adapted to whatever local conditions threw at him, ensuring his men were fed, happy, and ready to execute that hammer and anvil on demand. Honestly, without this brilliant supply network, those famous battlefield formations would have starved before they ever even saw combat.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. Would Alexander's legendary tactics have worked without the incredible machine his father built? Or was his true genius just knowing exactly how to use it? Did Philip build the greatest weapon in history, and Alexander just knew exactly which buttons to push to conquer the world? Was it the machine, or the man operating it, that truly brought the ancient world to its knees? It's like a giant historical puzzle, and I hope this breakdown of his tactical playbook leaves you with a fresh perspective on one of history's most fascinating debates.